Alright, first, let me take care of some business. You may have noticed that the last two movie reviews have come out a week late, and they've used still images instead of video. Well, after getting my first copyright strike on the first one and a flat rejection on my fair use claim for the second, I've decided it's safer and more efficient to switch back to stills for the foreseeable future. Luckily, though, that's not going to be an issue for this review. Today, I'll be taking a look at a real doorstopper of a fantasy novel, recommended by patron Eugenio Triana. The book is called The Name of the Wind, published by Patrick Rothfuss in 2007. About the author. Patrick Rothfuss was born in 1973 in Madison, Wisconsin. He had a generally uninteresting childhood, and when he went to college to get a bachelor's in English, he only went a few counties north to the University of Wisconsin campus in Stevens Point. He did go all the way to Washington State to get his master's degree, however. Throughout his time at college, and throughout another 5 years or so teaching part-time at Stevens Point, Rothfuss was writing what he liked to call the book. He tried very hard to get a publishing deal going for the book for many of those years, but he had no luck until 2002. That was the year he entered a chapter of the book in a short story competition, and when he won, publishers and literary agents started talking to him. By this point, the book was quite simply enormous, and so Rothfuss agreed to the publisher's request to break it into a trilogy. For reference, my paperback copy of the first book in this trilogy is over 700 pages long. I suppose because of this chopping up, he was able to publish The Name of the Wind just 1 year later, in 2007. The second installment of the Kingkiller Chronicles, The Wise Man's Fear, came out 4 years later, in 2011, and we're still waiting for the third book. However, he's written other works in the meantime, including The Slow Regard of Silent Things, a novella that follows a side character from the Kingkiller Chronicles, and The Adventures of the Princess and Mr. Whiffle, a young adult book with a completely unrelated story. Oh, and there's something else that's interesting about him, at least if you watch any online Dungeons & Dragons games. Patrick Rothfuss is a regular player for Penny Arcade's Acquisitions Incorporated game, and he's guest starred on the Acquisitions Inc. C-Team stream and on Geek and Sundry's Critical Role. Rothfuss is the guy with the curly hair and a really long beard. Anyway, that's about all I could dig up about the guy. That means it's time to move on to the story. The book starts out by spending a few chapters on its framing device. There's a quiet town where several locals like to have drinks at the inn. Drinks served by the red-headed innkeeper named Coat, or his assistant, Bast. But one day, one of them gets attacked by a strange metallic spider monster, and only kills it by chance. It burns when touched by cold iron, and so the locals figure it must be a demon. Meanwhile, a man known as Chronicler gets robbed by some army deserters. Later on, he gets attacked by more of those spider demons and rescued by Coat, who seems to know what they really are. Chronicler ends up at his inn the day after, and he confronts Coat. His real name must be Kvothe, a famous hero. Kvothe at first demands that Chronicler leave, but eventually the writer talks him into presenting a true account of his history. Kvothe tells him that it will take 3 days to present his full story, and Chronicler is not to change a single word. And with those terms in place, the main story begins. Kvothe was born a member of the Edema Rue, an ethnic group of traveling performers who are not also thieves and con artists despite their reputation. In fact, Kvothe's troupe is sponsored by a wealthy baron, so they can operate in just about any town they want. Kvothe himself is a born genius, and he learns at an incredible pace. Thus, when he sees a traveling wizard named Abinthy use real magic to scare off some superstitious locals, Kvothe talks him into joining the troupe as a special effects engineer, and into teaching him everything he knows. This includes basic science like physics, chemistry, and medicine, along with beginner's magic, something called sympathy. The way sympathy works in a magical sense is that the mage must first think 2 contradictory thoughts simultaneously, like this coin will fall when I let go of it, and this coin will hang in the air when I let go. Once you've mastered that, you can chant a binding spell to connect two similar things, and what you do to one will happen to the other. The more similar they are, the better, because the conservation of energy is still in effect, and differences create inefficiencies. That's why it's called sympathy. The lessons go well at first, but then Kvothe thinks that he should try to name the wind, with naming being the advanced tier of magic. Kvothe simulates this by binding the air in his lungs, and he nearly suffocates as a result. Abinthy stops the sympathy training at this point, and not long afterwards, he leaves the troupe to marry a wealthy widow. Meanwhile, Kvothe's father has been trying to write a new song about an ancient and tragic hero named Lanry, and the mysterious monsters called the Chandrian. But then, one day, the Chandrian show up in person and slaughter the entire troupe. Kvothe lives because he had wandered off at the time, and while they spot him when he returns, they have to leave before they can kill him. Kvothe learns some important details from this. Two sides of the Chandrian are Blue Flames and Decay. The group has a leader cloaked in permanent shadows named Haliax, and despite their power, the Chandrian have a list of enemies. Kvothe goes numb from grief at this point, at first living alone in the woods, and then living as a street urchin in the bad part of a city called Tarbeen. For 3 years, from ages 12 to 15, Kvothe lives on the streets. And while the boy's brain is shut down for this period, we, the audience, hear two important stories. First, we hear about Telu, a central figure in the setting's very Judeo-Christian religion. Telu, the creator god, took a mortal form to understand why wicked humans would be worth saving from the demons that tormented them. And as a mortal, he went around saving people and inducting them into his worship using a smithy hammer. He also cast out and smote the demons, with the most powerful and wicked demon being Incanis. Telu destroys Incanis, but he has to sacrifice his mortal form to do so. The second story is relayed by a mysterious storyteller at Kvothe's request. It's about Lanry, about how he and his wife were once the greatest defenders of an ancient empire. Lanry dies at one point, but his wife uses her magic to bring him back from the dead. Sadly, she herself dies later, and while Lanry studies magic to bring her back, he fails and falls into a deep nihilistic despair. He betrays the Empire in the hopes that another powerful wizard, Celatos, will kill him, but even Celatos can't do that thanks to the power of Lanry's wife. Instead, he curses Lanry by covering him in shadows and dooming him to never find peace. It takes Kvothe a bit to realize it, since his brain is still mostly shut down from grief, but he eventually realizes that Lanry and Haliax, Lord of the Chandrian, are one and the same. But thanks to this revelation, Kvothe's brain turns back on, and he realizes he's been wasting his life away. So he pawns the one valuable possession he has left, and buys passage to the university, the one and only place that teaches sympathy and naming magic. He impresses the masters enough to get a scholarship of 3 silver talents, the first person to ever get money from the university instead of paying out. But unfortunately, the money is only for 1 term, and 1 term at the university is 2 months. Kvothe quickly makes both friends and enemies at the university. His 2 best friends are Willem and Simon, and his 2 greatest enemies are Ambrose and Hema. Ambrose is the firstborn son of a wealthy baron and a bully who's used to getting what he wants, and so when Kvothe fights back, Ambrose takes it personally. Hema is the professor of basic sympathy and a different kind of bully, and so when he tries to humiliate Kvothe by having him run the class on the second day, Kvothe takes it as a challenge and uses a double binding to burn Hema's leg. Doing this almost gets Kvothe expelled, since magical malfeasance is a serious offense. The Masters are very sensitive about using magic to harm people, since it wasn't that long ago that wizards were burned at the stake for performing any kind of magic. Still, Hema literally asked for it, and could have stopped Kvothe at any point, so his sentence is reduced to reckless use of magic and a few public lashes. Kvothe takes a painkiller before the lashing so he won't feel the pain or bleed as much, but this later backfires. The drug's side effects slow Kvothe's brain, so he ends up paying Ambrose a talent for nothing and bringing an open flame into the archive. This gets him banned from the archive indefinitely, and kicks off the two students' rivalry. In the meantime, Kvothe needs to make some money, since you can't count on getting a negative tuition more than once. He can't get a loan since he has no collateral and no wealthy family, so he eventually has to go into debt with a surprisingly lovely loan shark. She still charges him 50% interest every 2 months, though. Kvothe also buys himself a second-hand lute and gets back into practice by playing in an abandoned campus courtyard. And that's how he meets Ori, a woman who went crazy trying to use naming magic and who now lives in the university's underworks. Once he decides he's back up to his old standards, Kvothe goes to the Aeolian Tavern in Imre, a town on the other side of the river from the university where nobles support artists of all kinds. If you can make it in the Aeolian, you can make it anywhere, and so Kvothe goes there and plays a famously difficult ballad. He pulls it off spectacularly, even though Ambrose was in the audience and cut one of the lute strings, and Kvothe needed a woman in the audience to sing the counterpart. The person who sang with him turns out to be Denna, a girl of about Kvothe's age whom he first met in the caravan to the university. Denna is the love interest of the story, but she keeps wandering off, since she's a penniless woman who can only really support herself by going on dates with different men and selling the gifts they shower her with. As for Kvothe's finances, they're looking up after he proves himself in the Aeolian, but Ambrose makes a point of sabotaging his attempts to get a noble patron or work at any inn that caters to nobles. Finally, we start to see some hints of the hero Kvothe will become. One day in the artificery, a dangerous compound shatters its container and starts a massive fire, and Kvothe saves a fellow student's life. Later, 2 ruffians, most likely working for Ambrose, corner him in an alley, either to rough him up or to kill him, and he uses sympathy magic to call fire and lightning and get away. The last part of the book starts when Kvothe overhears someone talking about a wedding party where everyone was slaughtered and blue flames were seen by the sole survivor. Kvothe drops everything and races north to investigate, getting a remarkably good horse for the trip, but then trading it to a tinker for a rare magnetic lodestone. In town, he discovers the survivor is Denna, of all people, and she agrees to investigate the remains of the wedding party with him. The two discover evidence that the Chandrian were responsible for the attack, but then they get sidetracked when they encounter a Dracus, a giant lizard with metallic scales that breathes fire, but is not an actual dragon. It eats trees, not cows, and this Dracus happened upon a hidden grove where criminals made resin, a kind of drug that's very similar to opium, except that it comes from refining tree sap. The Dracus has become addicted to the drug from eating the trees, and since it destroyed the camp, Kvothe decides it's too dangerous to leave alone. He and Denna gather all the processed resin and use it to try and poison the Dracus, but it ends up rampaging through a nearby town instead, and Kvothe ends up killing it by crushing it with a massive iron holy symbol. When Kvothe wakes up the next morning, he finds out that the townsfolk now consider him a holy man and a hero for what he did. He uses this reputation to gather information about the Chandrian attack, and he finds out that the cause is likely a large bowl with certain images on it that the father of the bride dug up from an ancient ruin. He fails to learn any more, however. After Kvothe gets back to the university, Ambrose taunts him again by grabbing his lute, which deeply upsets him, especially when Ambrose tosses it back and the lute smashes on the pavement. Kvothe is so angry that he calls the name of the wind, and he's completely out of it until the Master of Naming uses his magic to settle Kvothe's mind. He and Ambrose then go before the Masters, and Kvothe gets promoted instead of expelled, because a person's first naming is usually a traumatic experience. He does get a few more lashes, but then he also gets the Masters to fine Ambrose twice for stealing and then breaking his lute. Kvoth then gets Ori to help him find a secret way into the archives, and that is where the story within the story ends. Meanwhile, there are a few interludes with the present-day story. Chronicler discovers that Kvoth's assistant Bast is a Fey creature, and while they attack each other since Chronicler is a Telu-fearing wizard, Kvoth convinces them to shake hands and make up. Near the end of the night, one of the deserters who attacked Chronicler shows up at the tavern, but he's obviously possessed, and he only dies when the smith's apprentice smashes his head in with a cold iron rod. What possessed him was an evil Fey creature, something that Telu worshippers regularly mistake for demons. Finally, as Chronicler goes to bed, Bast appears to him and says that he's the reason that Chronicler even heard rumors about Kvoth's location. Bast wants Kvoth to remember the hero he used to be, so that he'll stop being the sad husk of a man that he's become. Bast then makes it clear that this will be Chronicler's goal, whether he likes it or not. And so, day 1 of the story ends. The analysis. Well, wouldn't you know it, we're back to the old buildings, Roman. This was a little more complicated than Spirited Away, though, and a fair part of that comes from the fact that this is a 700-page novel and not a 2-hour movie. A lot more happens in a big book like this one. First of all, let me just say that it's very clear that this book is part of a larger whole. The present-day plotline teases a lot of stuff that never comes up in the memoir, like the spider demons, the true nature of the possession creatures, the existence of the Fae, and the fact that Kvoth has apparently killed a king and started a war. We also hear several times that Kvoth gets expelled from the university, and that Ambrose is responsible, but as of the end of this book, he's still a member. Still, you get the sense as you read the book that the author knows what he's doing. This isn't just some random hints he's peppering through the novel to make it seem more interesting. He clearly has a plan for what happens next, and the only problem is that the book ends before he reaches it. That brings me to my next topic, world building. Patrick Rothfuss is using the fairly grounded technique of just like the real world, but just like the real world, a large number of the citizens follow a Christ-like figure who saves his followers and dies to protect them from demons who represent sin. But Telu is much less of a pacifist than Jesus and isn't really an all-loving God. Just like the real world, 2 of the main types of magic are sympathy, where like affects like, and naming, where you can command something or someone if you know its true name. But in this case, magic actually works and isn't just a dysfunctional outgrowth of scientific curiosity. The Name of the Wind is a story about the setting as much as it is a story about the protagonist, which is why it grinds to a halt twice in the middle of the book to tell stories within stories about the history of the world. Stories that contradict each other, and yet carry a few common elements that let you know that both have at least a kernel of truth and originally sprang from the same source. I could tell when I was reading that Rothfuss must enjoy studying history at least as much as I do, because I know exactly which topics he must have studied to come up with such a compelling alternate world. Something else I appreciate about the book is that it offers a wide range of characters with their own motivations and personalities. For example, while Kvoth is a street urchin, he decides to go begging in the good part of town on a holy day, when people would be feeling charitable. A woman takes pity on him and gives him a silver talent, a ton of money from his perspective, but then he loses it when a town guardsman kicks the shit out of him for leaving the terrible part of town. Then, when he's about to pass out from the injuries and the cold, a man wearing a devil mask helps him up and gives him some money and his gloves. There's also a former priest who cares for orphans who can't care for themselves, and he hands out all the bread and clean water he can spare. Kvoth himself is pretty far from being a high fantasy hero. He makes mistakes, he carries grudges, he comes up with plans that backfire on him as often as not. He acts like a stupid kid who thinks he knows more than he really does, because that's exactly what he is. He's got a lot of potential, and he knows a lot about science, music, and acting, but there are some things you can only really learn from direct experience, and that's exactly what happens throughout the book. I won't say this makes The Name of the Wind unique, because I've read a lot of other fantasy books with realistic characters, but if you can find the time to read this tome and its sequels, I'd certainly recommend you do so. Thanks for joining me again for today's book review, and I hope I'll see you next time for a tale about vampires on the moon.